yields to no one. Here, survival is measured in brutal, unforgiving fractions of a second. This is the grim toll exacted by a landscape pushed to its absolute physical limits. Panic dictates the flow. For the herd, sheer numbers provide the only viable armor against an ancient ambush. Beneath the surface, the rules of mammalian physics no longer apply. The advantage shifts instantly to the aquatic apex. Yet, this violence is merely the final punctuation mark of a much longer, agonizing journey. To understand the desperation at the water's edge, one must look to the horizon. It is late summer. Months of relentless drought have baked the moisture from the soil, shattering the earth. The great dry season acts as an ecological anvil, forcing all life into a nomadic existence. Driven by an innate biological imperative, they follow the invisible promise of rain. Every step drains finite energy reserves. Caloric deficit is a constant, shadow companion on this march. There is no strategy here, only endurance. They are tethered to a fading memory of green pastures. The social fabric of the herd is bound by proximity. To be separated in this vastness is a death sentence. As midday approaches, the ambient temperature soars, turning the plains into a thermodynamic furnace. Dehydration thins the blood. The absolute limit of mammalian endurance is rapidly approaching. A subtle shift in the wind carries a molecular change. The scent of moisture. The olfactory cue triggers a surge of adrenaline, temporarily overriding profound exhaustion. The geography of the Serengeti dictates that salvation and destruction often share the exact same coordinates. Months without rain have severely choked the flow, transforming a wide crossing into a concentrated bottleneck. The receding waters expose the steep architecture of the banks, turning a simple swim into an alpine descent. The geological record here is written in calcium, a silent testament to the gauntlet that awaits. Arriving at the precipice, instinctual caution takes hold. The genetic memory of this place runs deep. The visual calculation is grim. The drop is steep, the water opaque, and the current unpredictable. But it is not the fall that anchors them to the bank. It is the profound stillness of the water. A stillness deliberately engineered by millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The aquatic predators have been concentrated by the drought, forced into high-density strike zones. These bottlenecks create temporary, unstable truces among solitary giants. Ectothermic and incredibly patient, they can afford to wait. Their metabolism is designed for the long game. The dynamic is a stark imbalance. Absolute patience below, desperate, mounting pressure above. The sheer physics of a million animals arriving simultaneously removes the option of retreat. The structural integrity of the bank begins to fail under the immense kinetic load. The falling debris is an acoustic trigger. The ambush is deploying. They do not hunt as a pack, yet they share a highly coordinated geometry of interception. It is a profound psychological threshold. The biological imperative to cross wages war against the instinct to survive. The ecosystem requires this sacrifice. Without this annual influx of energy, the river would starve. Every sense is flooded. The sensory overload paralyzes the vanguard. The river holds its breath. The trap is perfectly set. And then, the physics of the herd overrides the psychology of the individual. The first leap is rarely a choice. The acoustic shockwave acts as the definitive catalyst. The dam has broken. He is utterly exposed. a lone target in a highly concentrated strike zone. The ambush triggers instantly. Millions of years of predatory reflex engaged in a single motion. The geometric advantage is absolute. The aquatic design effortlessly outpaces mammalian panic. At this range, there is no escape. The jaws are engineered for prehension, not chewing. But the herd's ultimate defense is deployed. A sudden, overwhelming sensory overload. The sheer kinetic bombardment disrupts the strike. The apex predator is temporarily overwhelmed by volume. The individual is lost to the collective. The crossing has officially begun. The primary threat now is not the jaws of the reptiles, but the crushing weight of their own kind. Even for those who survive the gauntlet, the terrain itself refuses to grant easy passage. The crocodiles adjust their strategy. The initial strike failed, but the buffet has arrived. The geometry of ambush must now evolve into a brutal war of attrition. Beneath the frantic surface, the aquatic realm operates on an entirely different sensory frequency. Vision is rendered useless by the dense, churning silt. The hunters must rely on more ancient instruments. These dermal pressure receptors cover their jaws, detecting microscopic shifts in water displacement. They do not need to see the panic to map its exact coordinates in the three-dimensional space. Yet, despite the abundance of prey, absolute chaos is an inefficient way to hunt. Ectothermic predators are bound by a strict energetic budget dictated by the African sun. Heat fuels their explosive muscle contractions, but prolonged exertion leads to rapid, fatal exhaustion. The shrinking river has forced a highly solitary species into a claustrophobic, tense proximity. Hierarchy here is established through immediate, violent displacement. Size dictates absolute authority over the best ambush coordinates. The penalty for insubordination is severe. Cannibalism is a practical reality in these concentrated zones. To avoid constant physical warfare, they utilize a profound, invisible language. Infrasonic rumbles, generated deep within the torso, broadcast a broadcast of dominance that travels for miles underwater. The acoustic perimeter is set. The ambush zone is now divided into highly specific, territorial lanes. With the hierarchy enforced, they return to the discipline of the hunt. They do not chase. They anchor themselves, utilizing the river's own current to bring the prey to them. Above them, the mammalian tide operates entirely on blind panic and herd mentality. It is a profound biological asymmetry, the erratic energy of fear versus the cold calculus of the ambush. The predators wait for a specific anomaly, a fracture in the structural integrity of the herd. An isolated target alters the sensory input. The geometric puzzle is solved. The biological safety mechanisms engage. The apex predator prepares to intercept. The geometry of the ambush relies on explosive, lateral acceleration. 3,000 pounds of bite force, evolved specifically to grip and secure immense weight. The kinetic transfer is absolute. The aquatic design immediately neutralizes terrestrial endurance. They lack the anatomy to chew. They must utilize physics to dismantle what they have caught. The death roll is a masterclass in leverage, designed to disorient and drown the prey in seconds. Lactic acid floods the mammalian system. Oxygen depletion rapidly shuts down the central nervous system. For the collective, the loss is mathematically insignificant. The relentless push forward cannot be halted. The biological transaction is complete. The energy of the savanna has been successfully transferred to the river. But in this highly concentrated ecosystem, a single kill is rarely a solitary event. The olfactory receptors of the surrounding giants have detected the sudden shift in the water's chemistry. The initial truce of the ambush lane is immediately shattered by the reality of a shared prize. To dismember prey of this magnitude, they paradoxically require the counterweight of their rivals. The ecosystem watches. The river's scavengers possess the patience to wait out the reptilian disputes. The pressure cooker of the drought ensures that every calorie must be fiercely defended. Here, survival is not merely about securing the kill, but possessing the sheer physical dominance to keep it. While the ancient predators war over the fallen, the desperate mammalian tide above shows no signs of slowing. The bottleneck on the bank has reached critical mass. The psychology of the herd is about to face its most grueling physical test. The geometry of the ambush has concluded. Now, they must face the edge of reason. The geographical border between life and death is measured in mere inches of unstable soil. Terrestrial biology was not designed for this level of extreme compression. The herd has become a singular, pressurized organism. Ectoparasites ruthlessly exploit the stationary mass. For the exhausted ungulates, the wait is a slow bleed of vital energy. The initial momentum of the crossing has violently stalled. The psychological barrier of the sheer drop has temporarily overpowered the instinct to cross. There are no leaders here. The vanguard is entirely involuntary, held hostage by the millions pushing blindly from behind. Within this crushing density, the vulnerable are instantly submerged. The social structure is buckling under the physical strain. As the standoff continues, the thermodynamic reality of the African noon sets in. The dust cloud acts as an insulating blanket, trapping the heat. Dehydration is no longer a distant threat. It is an immediate physiological crisis. Their core temperatures are approaching critical limits. Below, the aquatic predators register the pause. They recalibrate, resting in the cool, silty depths, while the sun does their preliminary work. The visual geometry of the drop is terrifying. To leap is to surrender entirely to gravity and the unknown. The very architecture of the bank is crumbling under the invisible, mounting kinetic load. The megaherd operates on fluid dynamics. A pressure surge, miles away, propagates violently to the front line. The physical resistance of the vanguard requires immense muscular exertion, burning the absolute last of their caloric reserves. The collective instinct fractures into a million desperate, individual battles for an extra inch of solid ground. The animals at the rear cannot see the river. They are driven solely by the olfactory memory of rain, completely unaware of the bottleneck they are crushing. The terror of the fall wages a brutal war against the agonizing reality of standing still. The river itself acts as a psychological weapon. Its profound stillness betrays nothing of the armored violence waiting below. The ecosystem demands motion. Stagnation in the Serengeti is a biological impossibility. The threshold of friction is finally breached. The physical mass of the rear guard overwhelms the braking power of the front. The geometry of the standoff collapses. The edge of reason is violently bypassed. The great crossing resumes, a blind, kinetic surrender to the brutal mathematics of survival. Gravity takes control, transforming the desperate herd back into a chaotic avalanche of bone, muscle, and absolute panic. The water's surface shatters, instantly transmitting a massive acoustic shockwave into the murky depths. The sensory input is overwhelming. The ambush protocol is instantly reactivated. They hit the water already exhausted, immediately forced into a desperate, high-exertion sprint against the heavy current. The gauntlet has reopened. The singular organism of the herd has committed its flesh to the ultimate test of endurance. Amidst the blind panic, the architects of this bottleneck move with ancient, terrifying precision. The structural integrity of the family unit is instantly pulverized by the physics of the crossing. In this chaotic fluid dynamic, the vulnerable are immediately isolated by the apex predators. Yet, the sheer, unrelenting volume of the herd provides an unintentional, chaotic shield. The overwhelming density of prey creates a kinetic barrier, temporarily frustrating the geometry of the ambush. Survival in the water merely grants access to a second, brutal physical hurdle. The exit point is heavily degraded. Every failed attempt smooths the clay, compounding the difficulty for those who follow. The earth itself begins to fail, heavily saturated by the churning water and the relentless assault of hooves. A new bottleneck forms. The animals are pinned, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The predators instantly recognize the shift in momentum. The trap has merely relocated to the shallows. This is the brutal apex of the dry season, a macroscopic event built upon millions of microscopic, individual tragedies. The geometric advantage is restored. Against the unyielding mud, the herd's kinetic shield completely dissolves. The river reclaims its absolute authority, heavily dictating the terms of biological exchange. Once the terrestrial anchor is lost, the descent into the aquatic realm is rapid and absolute. For the survivors, there is no processing of the trauma. The biological imperative dictates only forward motion, a solitary victory paid for entirely by the relentless caloric deficit of the drought. The geography has shifted, but the fundamental struggle for survival remains constant. Even in success, the ecosystem immediately begins to extract its toll. The scale of the migration defies individual success. The avalanche of bone and mud is self-sustaining. The apex predators process the harvest with chilling, prehistoric efficiency. The river itself has been fundamentally altered, transformed into a heavily saturated biological soup. For those still waiting, the edge of reason has been entirely obliterated. There is no hesitation left. The physics of the herd demands complete submission to the gauntlet. The visual geometry of survival is raw, chaotic, and absolute. The avalanche is now fully unleashed. The migration has reached its absolute critical mass. The river is no longer an obstacle. It is the epicenter of an avalanche. The sheer volume of the falling herd weaponizes their own bodies. The primary threat shifts instantly from predation to blunt force trauma. The physical space within the channel is completely exhausted. The biological volume of the herd exceeds the carrying capacity of the water. The river's composition is fundamentally altered. It is rapidly transforming into a dense, inescapable paste. The geometric advantage of the apex predators is violently shattered. The ambush has collapsed into sheer pandemonium. The sheer, unrelenting kinetic energy of the herd acts as an impenetrable, chaotic shield. To maintain an offensive position is to risk fatal injury. Even armor, honed by millions of years of evolution, must yield to this physical onslaught. The momentum of the avalanche creates a deadly gridlock. The crossing devolves into a desperate fight simply to keep the airways above the surface. Cardiovascular endurance is pushed to total failure. Lactic acid saturates the muscles, turning survival into a sheer mathematical impossibility. The thermodynamic furnace of the midday sun compounds the crisis, demanding energy that the ungulates simply do not have. Drowning in this gridlock is rarely violent. It is a slow, silent surrender to absolute physical depletion. The toll of the Gauntlet is extracted rapidly. The river begins to collect its massive biological tax. On the periphery of the chaos, the ambush resumes. The aquatic hunters adapt, targeting the weak and the exhausted who have drifted from the center. There is no need for violent expenditure of energy. The river's current does the lethal work. The parasitic load transfers seamlessly, indifferent to the host's demise. The predators have secured their harvest. The frantic crossing above is now entirely irrelevant to them. The topography of the riverbed becomes a lethal anvil. The unyielding push from behind forces the herd to literally crush itself. The physics of the bottleneck offers zero structural mercy. Every obstacle compounds the lethality of the crossing. The landscape is rapidly degrading. The very earth they seek to claim is washing away under their assault. The Gauntlet's final test is vertical. The degraded bank transforms survival into an agonizing, physical impasse. Structural failure is inevitable. The saturated earth offers no friction to the exhausted climbers. In this extreme density, failure is highly contagious. One slip creates a fatal domino effect. The biological debris of the failed attempts begins to alter the underwater topography. The physics of survival dictate a brutal pragmatism. The fallen become the very architecture of success. Success is built entirely upon the caloric and structural sacrifices of the herd. The geometric pressure is finally stabilizing. The tail end of the massive herd has arrived at the precipice. The immense kinetic load is lifting from the earth, leaving behind a scarred, heavily battered landscape. For the rear guard, the Gauntlet is radically different. The sheer volume that created the danger has now passed. The predators have reached absolute physical satiation. Ectothermic biology cannot process this volume of energy simultaneously. The biological transaction is closed. The river has reached its maximum predatory capacity. The acute kinetic energy of the avalanche diffuses. The environment slowly begins to process the immense physical disruption. The migration regains its terrestrial footing, forever altered, heavily taxed, but unbroken. There is no neurological space for relief. The caloric deficit demands immediate, relentless foraging. The genetic imperative pushes them forward. The memory of the crossing is instantly overwritten by the urgent biological need to graze. They have survived the Gauntlet, but the landscape they have entered is equally unforgiving. The rain they seek has not yet fallen here. The thermodynamic pressure of the dry season remains absolute. Behind them, the structural architecture of the river is profoundly reorganized by the sheer volume of organic matter. The sheer physics of the avalanche have directly altered the hydrological flow of the ecosystem. The immediate environment begins to rapidly adapt to the massive influx of dense, stationary mass. The apex predators have taken their fill, but the ecosystem's highly efficient waste management system is merely arriving. The dense accumulation of carcasses creates new, volatile territorial disputes among the river's permanent residents. For the mega herbivores, the aftermath is a physical obstruction that must be violently cleared to restore their domain. Satiation breeds profound patience. The reptiles have no need to engage in unnecessary caloric expenditure. The localized violence of the crossing provides a massive, sustained biological subsidy to the entire river corridor. The thermodynamic engine of the dry season ticks relentlessly forward. The peak of the day has broken. The landscape is abruptly abandoned, leaving behind only the geological scars of the kinetic event. The aerial scavengers lock onto the olfactory and visual cues. The ecological harvest is ready to be fully processed. The individual is sacrificed to sustain the complex, interconnecting web of the broader ecosystem. The architects of the ambush fade back into the ancient, silent depths, their biological mandate fulfilled. The avalanche is over, but the intricate biological transaction it initiated has only just begun. The violent kinetic energy of the river has ceased, instantly replaced by the ruthless efficiency of the cleanup crew. In the Serengeti, death is never a conclusion. It is a highly competitive, immediate biological transfer. The sheer concentration of protein acts as a geographic magnet, drawing specialists from miles across the savanna. The harvest operates on every conceivable scale, from the massive scavengers down to the microscopic level. Hierarchy at the carcass is absolute, dictated entirely by size and the specific engineering of the beak. The marabou possesses the structural mass to intimidate, easily parting the sea of smaller scavengers. Their anatomy allows them to bypass the tough exterior hide, accessing the calorie-rich internal organs. The thermodynamic furnace of the afternoon accelerates the process of decay, turning the river into a biological incubator. The ecological subsidy extends perfectly into the aquatic food web. Nothing is wasted. The apex predators have entered a state of profound torpor. Their metabolic needs are met for weeks, perhaps months. But the river is heavily populated by giants who view this harvest purely as a structural invasion. Hippos are strictly herbivores, yet territorial aggression drives them to violently dismantle the blockages in their domain. This violent displacement serves a critical ecological function, preventing the complete stagnation of the water flow. By clearing the bottleneck, the hippo inadvertently distributes the biological wealth miles downriver. The kinetic energy of the avalanche is transformed into sustained, distributed nourishment. Competition among the scavengers remains fiercely mathematical. Every calorie is fiercely contested. The architects of the slaughter require cold, still water to manage their immense caloric intake. Micro-niches are exploited with surgical precision. The ibis capitalizes on the massive displacement of Earth. The thermodynamic pressure begins its slow, daily retreat. The brutal midday furnace is ending. Ectothermic biology requires constant, precise calibration to the shifting environment. Not all casualties were immediate. The river always claims a slow, lingering tax. The scavengers possess an innate ability to calculate the exact threshold of terminal exhaustion. The geological trap is absolute. The riverbed itself secures the final harvest. Above and below, the ecosystem quietly prepares to process the final stragglers. For the megaherd, the trauma of the river is already miles behind them. The biological imperative overwrites fear. They have survived the gauntlet only to face the unrelenting threat of starvation. The terrestrial predators have noted the arrival. The gauntlet of the savanna is seamlessly replacing the gauntlet of the river. The parasitic load remains constant. The drain on their finite energy reserves never ceases. The mathematical scale of the migration is the only thing that ensures the survival of the species. Satiation brings a heavy, lethargic peace to the river gorge. The frenetic energy of the harvest is spent. The biological deconstruction is incredibly rapid. Bone is all that remains of the immense muscular energy. The final stage of the harvest is microscopic, ensuring maximum energetic efficiency. The architects of the slaughter briefly inspect the remains, confirming the absolute depletion of the resource. The thermodynamic shift is undeniable. The long, brutal reign of the afternoon is ending. As the thermals begin to die down, the aerial scavengers must expend massive energy to retreat to their roosts. The river returns to its profound stillness, hiding the immense violence of the day beneath its opaque surface. The earth records the trauma, preserving the immense kinetic footprint of the megaherd. The biological clock of the stragglers completely expires. The transition is seamless. The harvest simply resets its parameters. But the true reset of the ecosystem relies on a much larger atmospheric shift. A profound molecular change carries on the shifting winds. The scent is unmistakable. The thermodynamic anvil of the dry season is finally cracking. The biological compass instantly realigns. The promise of rain is no longer a memory. It is a visible, approaching reality. The ecosystem braces for the violent atmospheric collision that will dictate the next phase of survival. In the ancient depths, the apex predators await the changing of the seasons in perfect, unyielding silence. The shift is instantaneous. The prolonged starvation of the land is over. The wet season arrives not with a whisper, but with absolute, overwhelming force. The hydrological reset begins. The river immediately starts to erase the scars of the crossing. The geography of survival shifts again, washed clean by the violence of the shifting winds. The slate is wiped entirely clean, preparing the landscape for the inevitable return of the endless march. The deluge acts as an aggressive geological eraser. The immense atmospheric pressure equalizes, releasing millions of tons of suspended moisture back to the earth. The hydrological dynamics flip instantly. The concentrated, stagnant pools are aggressively flushed out by the violent influx of new water. The river reclaims its velocity, tearing away the biological remnants of the crossing and distributing the calcium and minerals far downstream. The aquatic apex predators are forced to yield to the current. Their ambush geometry is completely nullified by the overwhelming fluid dynamics of the wet season. The architecture of the bottleneck is physically dismantled. The earth itself is restructured, preparing a new, unpredictable topography for the following year. For the megaherd, the storm offers no immediate comfort. It is a period of intense thermal stress, shocking their exhausted systems. Yet, this intense physical baptism removes the heavy parasitic load and the suffocating dust that has plagued their march for hundreds of miles. The sudden drop in ambient temperature demands a massive expenditure of caloric energy just to maintain core thermal equilibrium. But in the Serengeti, extreme violence is always a prerequisite for profound cellular regeneration. The dormant root systems, waiting beneath the cracked earth for months, respond instantly to the influx of moisture. The thermodynamic engine has reset. The landscape rapidly transforms into the most productive terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. This is the sole mathematical justification for the Gauntlet. The caloric reward required to sustain a population of over 1 million mammals. The immense energy deficit incurred during the crossing is rapidly balanced by the high protein shoots of the newly sprouted savanna. The pressurized, singular organism of the herd relaxes, breaking back down into loose, complex family structures and relaxed social dynamics. The arrival of the rain does not end the struggle. It merely changes the predatory paradigm. The terrestrial hunters thrive in the thick cover, while the river itself enters a state of profound aquatic restoration. The apex reptiles no longer need to crowd into claustrophobic, violent ambush lanes. The river has expanded their territory 100-fold. Satiated by the harvest and scattered by the flood, they fade back into the ancient rhythm of the aquatic ecosystem. The geographical border has been crossed. The brutal toll has been exacted, and the balance of the ecosystem has been perfectly maintained. The biological imperative is blind to the past. It only recognizes the immediate necessity of the present moment. This is the raw, unedited architecture of the wild, a relentless, beautiful machine operating on the currency of life and death. The river of death yields to the season of life, until the earth dries, the grass withers, and the eternal march begins again.